The attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump comes as fears grow over the rise in political violence in America. In recent years, the U.S. has seen a number of its politicians under threat. Let's go back to January of 2011. Arizona Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, a Democrat, was having a meet and greet in a grocery store parking lot. An attacker opened fire, shot Giffords in the head. The gunman killed 6 people, shot 18 others, but Giffords survived. 6 years later, Republican House Majority Leader Steve Scalise was shot while he was at a Republican congressional baseball practice. Scalise was in a coma for 3 days. 5 victims were also taken to the hospital. In 2020, law enforcement prevented an elaborate scheme to kidnap the Democratic governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. 13 people, some with links to a local right-wing militia group, were arrested. And then there's January 6, 2021. Trump supporters descended on the Capitol building in protest of Joe Biden becoming president. One protester was shot and killed by police, another crushed in the stampede. Others died from heart attack or stroke. In the days and weeks after January 6th, 5 police officers who were there that day also died. At least 2 took their own life. More than 1,200 people have been charged in connection with January 6th, including Donald Trump, indicted for inciting the mob. And in 2022, a man broke into the San Francisco home of Nancy Pelosi armed with a hammer and zip ties, looking to kidnap the former Speaker of the House, who was in Washington at the time. Unable to find his target, the man instead attacked her husband, Paul Pelosi, hitting him in the head with the hammer and fracturing his skull. Robert Pape studies political violence and is the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats, and he joins me now. Robert Pape, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, David.
It's quite the summary of incidents, and that's in no way exhaustive. We have political leaders from all the parties saying it's time to lower the rhetoric, lower the temperature. What does your research tell you about the audience they're speaking to and how receptive they are?
Well, since January 6th, my center, the Chicago Project on Security and Threats at the University of Chicago, has conducted over a dozen nationally representative surveys of support for political violence in the United States. And we most recently did one at the end of June, just a little over 2.5 weeks ago. And we have some stunning findings that we discovered. That is that 10% of American adults, that equates to 26 million American adults, support the use of force to prevent Donald Trump from becoming president. That's really quite an amazing number. And also, if we look deeper at that group, we see over a third of them own guns. About half of them have a negative view of the police going in. About 40% of them have attended a protest in the last 12 months. So this is really quite a politically active group and quite a dangerous group. And unfortunately, the assassination attempt that we just saw against Donald Trump is a manifestation of this. And in fact, just last week, I was briefing law enforcement on our findings and warning that we had to be concerned about an assassination attempt against former President Trump.
So 1 in 10% of the people you surveyed said the use of force is justified to prevent Donald Trump from becoming president. And 1 in 3 of those, which would translate to about 9 to 10 million people, say they own guns.
Yes.
On the other side,
exactly right.
Yeah. So on the other side of it, 7% of the people you surveyed say they support force to restore Trump to the presidency. So these beliefs exist. I mean, what does this tell us about the state of U.S. politics and the volatility of the electorate?
This tells us that we are a tinderbox in the United States. We have radical wings in the public, and we basically are seeing that support for political violence has become normal. We worry that this could become normalized over the last few years. Well, now we're here. So we are seeing the normalization of political violence. We're seeing that it is not simply a short-term thing. Our surveys, we do this every 3 or 4 months. So we have actually some stable patterns here. This 10% number is a high number, so this is getting worse. But overall, what we are seeing is that there's large parts of the public on supporting violence for a set of right-wing causes, some for supporting violence for left-wing causes. And what happened for Donald Trump, that was only seconds with that assassination attempt, but this has been building for quite some time.
Okay, because that's where I wanted to go next, because I've been doing some reading on, what political scientists call affective polarization. How over the decades, parties where they've all moved away from the middle, you've gone from disagreeing with your neighbor if they voted for someone else to really disliking your neighbor if you voted for someone else. And so these divisions are becoming cemented. So is it the extension of that is building to these sort of extremist points, or is there something more beyond
well,
that?
that's another way to describe also what I'm describing, but there's a deeper set of problems here. You see, we are going through in the United States a major demographic shift from a white majority democracy to a white minority democracy. And yes, that's been happening in small ways for starting about 30 years ago. But in the last 10 years, this has really become important. This helps to explain a lot of our politics and then a lot of the violence. You see, right now, we have about 62% of Americans are non-Hispanic white. In the next 10 years, maybe 15, this will become 49%. So we are right now at the tipping point, and this has been going on, this tipping point, starting about 10 years ago. Well, there's a large part of the public that wants to stop that. They want to freeze that. They don't want this change to occur. And then there's another significant part of the public that wants to not only have that occur, but have it occur maybe faster. So now you can see why immigration is such a huge issue in the United States in the last 5-10 years, when it hasn't really been an issue in the United States for going back to the 1920s. I mean, so what's happening is we are going through this major demographic shift. And you are now getting polarization. You're getting all these effects of, say, the gerrymandering and so forth, but this is happening in a period of demographic change that's fundamental. Other countries, by the way, I've briefed the Canadian government about a year ago on certain trends in Canada. Canada, France, Germany, other mature Western democracies are also going through demographic shifts. They're a little further out than the American, and also a little different detail. But fundamentally, America was the world's first genuine democracy 248 years ago. It is now heading to become the world's first multiracial democracy. But this is not coming without a lot of consternation inside the United States. So it's not simply going to be fixed by, well, we're going to fix gerrymandering or we're going to add a few people to the Supreme Court. There's some fundamental disagreements right now in the United States.
Right, so you got a shift in culture, you have the culture wars, you overlay conspiracy on top of that, the declining trust in institutions and media, and you get this powder keg for extremism. And Robert Pape, I know they're saying everyone lower the temperature, but I want to show you a tweet that came out in the aftermath of the shooting attempt on Saturday. This is from J.D. Vance, who is now the vice president nominee. He says he tweeted this weekend that rhetoric from the Biden campaign directly led to this assassination attempt. Despite, so when you look at that, I mean, how do Americans turn down the temperature? Because you have that.
Well,
you have people on the left. Sorry, just finish my point. You have people on the left saying this was faked, immediately, and putting out those conspiracy theories. How do you come back from this? Sorry.
The way you come back from this is there have been far more statements in the last few days. And in fact, these may be replaced by more J.D. Vance statements. But still, the last few days we have seen for the first time, really, a group of Democratic leaders and Republican leaders strongly condemn political violence, and do so in terms that we've done messaging studies that are just what the middle of our country wants to hear. You see, 75% of our public abhors political violence. They really stunned that this is happening in our country over this era that we have fallen into, and so it is simply the case that there is reason to hope. But this is a big challenge, and it's hard to get bipartisan condemnation of political violence. This really has happened for the first major time given all the political violence events you just laid out, since the Trump assassination. And the real challenge is keeping that going, because as we go forward, we are also in the most contested political race in our lifetimes. It's over these huge issues in our country. Should we be a white majority democracy, or should we be a multiracial democracy? These are going to be fundamental decisions about America and America's identity. And you're going to get people who are going to be quite angry. The way to deal with the anger is to vector the anger toward voting. And that's really the purpose of the messaging that we should be given. You see, the goal is not to talk people out of being angry, given the issues I've just explained. And then you added the gasoline of social media on top of the fire, right? So you add all that together, you're not stopping anger. The question is, where does that anger go? Does it go to violence? Or should you tell people, as I've been doing and encouraging political leaders to do, that if you're angry, go join a campaign. If you think Donald Trump has been abused here, join the Trump campaign, help him win in a landslide. If you think that it's actually the Democrats who are really being abused here, then go join the Democratic campaigns and help them win in a landslide. Take your energy and put it toward voting. That is the way out of this.
Robert Pape, I really appreciate all of the insight. That's Robert Pape, director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. We're going to hit you up to come back. I want to hear about the research you have on Canada. So we'll save that for a future day. Robert Pape, it was good to meet you. Thank you, sir.
Good to meet you too, David.
Political leaders in this country are reacting to the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump, saying violence is not the way to respond to political disagreement.
If you want to change the government, you participate in an election and you go to vote. You don't engage in acts of political violence.
It should not be that we treat political opponents as enemies. It shouldn't be that we've got violence being inflamed.
Things have gone too far. The leader of the opposition in Alberta has described me as dangerous. When you start using that kind of rhetoric, that ends up creating an elevated risk for all of us.
Pierre Poilievre wasn't on camera today, but when asked by Global News Radio host Alex Pearson if referring to the Prime Minister's policies as wacko is part of the problem, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre said his criticisms are reasonable.
My criticisms of the Prime Minister have been entirely reasonable and focused on his policy agenda. We are not going to censor ourselves now. We're not going to allow this shooter to shut down our debate.
Okay, let's talk about the political rhetoric that's happening here in Canada. We're going to bring in the power panel on that. Rob Russo is the former CBC Parliamentary Bureau Chief. Brad Levine is a former Communications Director for the NDP. And here with me in the studio, Vandana Cotter is a former advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and Kate Harrison is a Conservative political analyst. Rob, let's start with you. You spent many years reporting out of Washington. If Donald Trump was looking straight ahead instead of looking right, the bullet hits the back of his skull, and it's a completely different world today. I mean, what was your reaction to the assassination attempt on Saturday and the political response since?
Well, I particularly after listening to Mr. Pape, whose presentation was fascinating, I don't think that we should have been surprised, even though it was a shocking event. It's clear that this is a society that is bitterly divided. There are bilge pumps from social media pumping even more bile into that debate. The rhetoric is overheated and it is dangerous. You put that together with ready access to guns, and you've got a very potent and dangerous cocktail. Now, that being said, I have to caution people. If you look at U.S. history, a lot of the people who were involved in either assassination attempts or assassinations didn't really have a clear political motive. The person who tried to kill Ronald Reagan was trying to impress actress Jodie Foster. Lee Harvey Oswald tried to kill a right-wing general, failed, and then tried to kill, and then succeeded in killing John F. Kennedy only because he was a pipsqueak trying to make some sort of monstrous mark on history. The assassin of McKinley was somebody who was looking for a consular appointment. So we got to be very, very careful about ascribing motive before we find out what's going on there.
No, you're absolutely right on that. And we know who fired the shots. We know who he was trying to hit, but Brad, we still don't know why. We still don't know how he was able to do what he did, the shooter in this case. But I wonder, what are your thoughts, Brad, on the calls to lower the temperature in the U.S. from the political leaders there, and whether there are any lessons for Canada in all of this? Because, there is a guy who just got parole for crashing the gates of Rideau Hall with a truck full of guns and bad intentions to go get the Prime Minister, right? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's important that political leaders in Canada, take the opportunity that this event affords to talk about what the discourse could be. And I think you saw that in some of the clips that you just played at the opening here. But I also think that it's important that leaders, when they talk about the tone, that they lead by example. And while I disagree, I respectfully disagree with Premier Smith, who was calling on progressives to watch the tone in Canada. I don't know if that only inflames the kind of the tension within our country, which is by no means anywhere in the same league as that of the United States. But without question, we have, I think I would submit, a growing problem in this country. One of her predecessors had to have extra, detail, Premier Rachel Notley, in the 2017, 2018, 1 year and a bit into, because of the increased death threats from there. So, I think the backhanded comments of Premier Smith probably don't do, I think, justice to the situation. I think it can come from the leaders, but they also have to lead by example and practice what they preach. They can't, it's hard to draw that line, right? Oh, is the word dangerous, leading to people to take political violence? I don't know if those are maybe the best examples. I don't know where one draws a line, but clearly one has to lead by example, and I don't think her remarks advance the conversation. They only maybe highlight one side. I'm not going to say that both sides are mutually the same in terms of the rhetoric. I think Canadians can make their own decision, but I think it's important that the leadership in this country call out, but lead by example is, I think, more important.
But, Vandana, I think Premier Smith's comments highlight something interesting, that she sees conservatives being demonized, and her criticism of people on the progressive side of the ledger she sees as legitimate. Progressives see themselves being demonized, and their criticism of people on the conservative side of the ledger as totally legitimate and fair. Nobody talks to each other. There's this great polarization. The media gets demonized if we don't take sides and accuse of many things. And we're not in the same league as the U.S. as Brexit, but we're not far off in some cases.
Yeah, politics has definitely taken a shift in the last 15 years where I've been in politics. I've seen, when I was in opposition, not a single Liberal member in my tiny caucus at the time needed detail. But when I went to the last Laureate Club, I think a number of ministers needed detail. I've seen other members of the opposition needing detail as well. So things have fundamentally shifted. And I think instead of placing blame on each other, we have to look at the root causes of this increase of hate. The one thing I've seen has changed over the last 15 years is social media. First there's Facebook, then Twitter, there's Instagram, there's TikTok, and a number of, anyone with a microphone can have an opinion and share their information and be seen as legitimate. And I think with social media, and we've seen that during the pandemic, the more we talk to people who only think like us, and you dehumanize another side of it. So you no longer need to have a conversation. Me and Kate had a lovely conversation outside. We have different political perspectives, but you can share an opinion and agree with each other and still go for a beer after that. But I feel like what's happening now, people no longer want to hear another perspective, and it's easy to get caught in social media. You go through your algorithm and you go down this dark hole, and hate's a powerful emotion. Couple that with a feeling of desperation, that we have to look at the root causes. So you're looking at gun control, you're looking at social media, mental health issues. We really need to focus on that as well, along with taking down the tone.
Yeah, Kate, it's people go online or tune into news programs not for information so much, but for affirmation. And the divide is just growing, and being filled with rhetoric, demonizing the people you're not talking to.
Yeah, and despite being more connected than ever, we're arguably more alone, right? There's more isolationism happening, and you know, part of that is I also think people are expecting quite a bit from their politicians. There's a heightened level of transparency, of access, et cetera. They want more from their politicians due to the 24-hour news cycle, social media, et cetera. So those demands are great. I do think that it is important, though, to separate what we had happen on the weekend, which is, you know, a horrific incidence of violence, from this broader conversation around rhetoric and tone, because I think we fall into a bit of an issue in suggesting that words are violence. You can have a pointed criticism of a politician and, you know, be very blunt in your assessment of the state of affairs in Canada or America or wherever you are, and that is not the same thing as an incitement to violence. So sure. I do, you know, I take Brad's point that leaders should lead by example and choose words carefully. I do think that, you know, metaphorical turns of phrase like wacko or what have you, or I think, you know, putting somebody in the crosshairs, et cetera, I don't think that's the same thing as a sustained, regular kind of political drumbeat and attack and incitement to violence, and we should be careful about trying to distinguish those things from one another. Right.
Look, Rob. You know, metaphors get used all the time, right? In writing and in just sort of political argument and political debate. But there is a persistent demonization that is creeping into politics here. I don't think there's any question about it. That, you know, I'm not trying to both sides it, but you have Pierre Poilievre laying the deaths of the drug crisis at the feet of Justin Trudeau. You have Trudeau and other Liberals, every time Pierre Poilievre is in the room with someone who holds unsavory beliefs, accusing him of creeping into white nationalism and these sorts of things. And, you know, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of this, and that there is just, the divide seems so broad right now, even here, even if it doesn't rise to what happened in Pennsylvania.
I think the thing that's changed most markedly since I first arrived in Ottawa, when the Earth's crust was cooling, was that there is far more of an attack of the individual rather than an attack on the ideas of the individual. Right. And I think, I mean, we've talked often about the coarsening of the debate. I think that's irrefutable. And I think that we can be smug sometimes in Canada in saying that it couldn't happen here, it wouldn't happen here. Let's look at some statistics. In 2019, just 5 scant years ago, before the pandemic, the Sergeant-at-Arms was looking into 8 instances of threats against members of Parliament. In 2023, 4 years later, it's now 530. So something is happening. Also, we've been very lucky. Many of us were on Parliament Hill in October 2014 when a gunman didn't amble, he had to shoot a guard, Sam, at the doors of the center block, wandered right down the Hall of Honor, and if he had had the wit to realize to his left was an open door, he could have killed the Prime Minister and many people in cabinet. Yeah. So we've been very lucky in Canada, and we do have to guard against this. And the threat to people who are in politics, not just federally, but provincially, at the municipal level, has gone up and has driven people out of politics now.
Yeah, you're seeing mass resignations at the municipal political level. There's been a lot of women in particular bowing out, particularly in Quebec. It seems to be a bit of an epidemic. So there are things happening there, Brad, that it becomes difficult and impossible to keep ignoring because it's hard enough to get people to come into public life. It's even harder when they're actively being driven out in large numbers, particularly on one side of the gender line.
Well, that's right. We just had a recent example in Alberta where the former Environment Minister, Shannon Phillips, she resigned effective July 1, basically just saying this is no longer tolerable. She's been elected for a number of terms now, member of a cabinet. Again, had to have detail around her when she was Minister of the Environment, but the threats and the harassment, constant, and it just creates an environment where people no longer want to serve. It's difficult to get people wanting to stand for election, particularly women who are, I would submit, targeted much more than men. I think people of color are targeted much more than white people who are elected in this country. Hard enough to get them to run and then to stay in office because of the harassment. I think that one of the things that needs to be pointed out, in addition to the it was mentioned, social media for certain has played a role in terms of being able to fuel some of this harassment, but also the pandemic. The pandemic, I think, to Rob's point about the sergeant in arms having only a handful of cases prior to the pandemic, hundreds following the pandemic. The obvious difference here is what the effects of the pandemic had on things like mental health. And for much of the harassment, some of it may be couched in political positions, but a lot of it is based on mental health. And it's, I don't want to or ignore the notion that it might be, either the conservatives or, right wing or the left wing. But I think there's a basis here of mental health in this country. We're not going to fix this until we address the mental health crisis in this country.
Yeah, bad things happen when people are isolated, alone, and afraid. Brad, I want to just quickly stick with you because I want to show the tweet. There was a lot of reaction over the weekend from the leaders to the shooting in Pennsylvania, saying they're very happy to see that Donald Trump wasn't killed. But there was something in Pierre Poilievre's statement that jumps out at a lot of people. I want to show this. He says, "I condemn in the strongest of terms the attempt to murder former President Trump today. I'm relieved he is safe. My prayers are with other innocent people harmed or killed by this heinous act." He said, "I'm also happy that the suspected shooter is dead. Democracy must prevail." What do you make of that particular line? "I'm also happy that the suspected shooter is dead." Just quickly.
Yeah, I saw that tweet, and it also jumped at me. I don't think that helps cool down. Nobody's going to obviously support a suspected killer, but I don't know what the advantage here of taking delight in the tragedy. He called it the suspected killer. Yeah. I don't know if there's many people that would want to see him get away, the killer get away scot-free. But it's just there's a tone that jarred me when I read that tweet, where I don't know what the advantage here of going that distance to show glee in another person's death, even though that person is suspected of doing something very heinous.
Okay, I want to get everyone else in on that. Vandana, what were your thoughts on that? Interesting. I've never seen that before from a leader. I was just struck by it. What are your thoughts?
I don't think celebrating death in any case is something to do. I don't think it helps with the tone. I look back at that moment with John McCain when he was up against Obama, and that woman sharing some misinformation about Obama and him correcting it and saying, actually, Barack Obama is a good man, actually. Yeah. I don't know who would do that today. Who would actually take a moment to be like, I actually don't dislike this person. We have fundamental political differences. And I think while I agree with Kate on words like crosshairs, I don't think that can be misconstrued. But going back to Brad's point on mental health issues, if you connect with people with extremist views, maybe for you don't share those views, but to someone suffering in mental health alone, a lot of these people are lone actors. That could be a calling. That could be something unintentionally. Right. Someone has said, well, that's now an endorsed view and that's okay. Right? And I think when you couple mental health and you couple those actions with people who, where someone else will be like, that's different, I can separate that, someone else may not, right? And I think that's something that we have to really be cognizant of.
Kate, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I didn't have the same reaction. I think that, what I took away from that was, here is a terrorist madman who is intent on inflicting harm on people, and it is better that he is not around to do that. And I think that is a completely, appropriate reaction that many would have. I'm sure, if I was thinking about other horrific incidents like the Boston Marathon bombing, for instance, where, if I'm not mistaken, political leaders said it's a good thing that those two were killed and dealt with. But I think that is a fairly, uncontroversial reaction from a political leader when someone sought to assassinate the president of the United States, did kill someone, did critically injure two other people. This was a terrorist attack. He was intent on killing as many people as he could. Motive, whatever it may be, political or mental health or otherwise.
Yeah, well, and we still don't know, and in part because because we can't question the guy that hurts the investigation. So Rob, I got 20 seconds. I've gone over time. Just your quick thoughts on that.
Sure. I've been to presidential rallies. I've stood very near the stage. I would be very happy if this guy was dead as well while I was standing there. He was intent on killing people. He did kill people. That being said, if you're an investigator, I'm sure you'd want to talk to the guy. But if your choice is between neutralizing or interrogating somebody, you neutralize the threat immediately, make sure that person can't hurt anybody else. The language might not have been elegant, but it's hard to argue against the sentiment.
Okay, we're going to let that be the last word. I want to thank the Power Panel for walking through all of that. Vandana Cotter, Kate Harrison, Rob Rousseau, and Brad Levine, thank you so much. Well, here in Canada, we have not seen anything in recent years quite like the assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump. But that doesn't mean there haven't been serious incidents of violence or threats directed at Canadian politicians. 4 years ago this month, Corey Hearn crashed his pickup truck through the gates of Rideau Hall. The former Canadian Ranger then set out on foot with 3 loaded guns and a knife with the intention of arresting the Prime Minister. Hearn got 6 years in jail and was just released on parole. And just a quick Google search shows a series of incidents from across the country of other people arrested, charged, or convicted of threatening mostly the Prime Minister and also some premiers. But as alarming as that is, it's not the entire story.
In 2023, there was 530 files open, so that's a significant increase.
In May, the Sergeant-at-Arms, the person in charge of security in the House of Commons, said harassment and threats against MPs has jumped by 800%. MPs have been issued panic buttons. They've added security systems to their constituency offices. And those stats and stories don't even begin to capture what is happening at the provincial and municipal levels. None of it has yet risen to the levels we saw on Saturday in Pennsylvania, but 10 years ago, it did. That's when a gunman stormed Parliament Hill, an eruption of violence that ended when he was killed in a fatal shootout in the Hall of Honor. Politicians and political staff barricaded themselves inside meeting rooms and their offices and escaped harm. But not everyone did. 24-year-old Corporal Nathan Cirillo, a reservist from Hamilton, was murdered by the gunman before he assaulted Parliament Hill. Cirillo was standing guard at the National War Memorial next to the tomb of the unknown soldier. Marco Mendicino is a Liberal MP and a former Minister of Public Safety, and he joins me now. Marco Mendicino, it's good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
The urgent focus is on Trump, but you know, as we've just laid out, there's been this surge of threats and violence. I mean, what have you seen as an MP and in your old role as Public Safety Minister?
Well, I've seen the alarming increase in political violence, which was just cataloged in your intro. 800% in the last 5 years. We're talking about more online harassment. We're talking about more death threats. We're talking about more physical assaults. And I've experienced, and my family has experienced, all 3 of those things. But it's not just me, and it's certainly not just Liberals. I was deeply concerned when Mr. Poilievre's wife was threatened. I strongly condemn that incident. I was deeply concerned when my friend and colleague, Chrystia Freeland, was accosted and boxed into an elevator in Alberta. I strongly condemn that incident. And I think it's a reflection of the time. Look, I watched the assassination attempt of former President Trump with horror. And certainly we wish him a speedy recovery, and we express our sincerest condolences to the victims of that shooting. And I think as Canadians, we have this propensity to kind of look at political violence and think that that's something that happens over there or somewhere else in some other country. And my bottom line is this, is that political violence is happening here. It's happening in Canada. It's having a direct impact on the lives and safety of not only parliamentarians, but their families and their staff who serve on the front lines of constituency offices, and we've got to do more about it.
I mean, we don't know what would have happened had Corey Hearn gotten to the Prime Minister. We don't know what would have happened had Michael Zahav-Bibeau not been confronted and intercepted inside the Hall of Honor. We know what happened when he wasn't at the National War Memorial. I saw a video of you getting spit on by a guy just on the street the other day, and you talked it down and de-escalated it, but there's this focus now on tone and rhetoric and social media. I mean, what do you think is fueling it? What do you think the answer is right now?
Well, I think there are a variety of things that are contributing to the increase in violence. I do think extreme rhetoric from every quarter, I want to be clear, it needs to be taken down. This is not just about pointing the finger at the other side, saying you're the problem. I think as politicians and as leaders, we have to look in the mirror. And so calling each other names, casting personal attacks, using language like liars and cheats and criminals, I think pours gas on the flames. I also think that the spread of disinformation and that the role that media plays in that is extremely important, as does engaging social media platforms. I'm all for free speech. I've been part of the cut and thrust of some of the most intense debates in this country. But we do need social media to play a responsible, proactive role in not chilling free speech, but making sure that the digital and cyber town squares are a place where people can be safe. And that is just simply not the case right now.
Do you think politicians take it seriously enough? I've long felt that nothing lowers the estimation of politicians in the eyes of the public than the behavior of politicians. Not necessarily something you do that makes people think less of you, but the way people talk about you and you talk about them and the back and forth of it all. Do you think politicians in the hunt for narrow partisan advantage realize the broader impact they're having to the way the profession is held in public esteem?
I do. I think it explains why increasingly Canadians are becoming more skeptical about what motivates politicians, the soundbite, the clip, the savvy, hard-hitting post. And certainly in the moment, it can seem like it is an effective tool. But there's a consequence to that. And there is equally a consequence when people who are crossing the Rubicon and are going from free speech into the incitement of violence and hatred, where there are no charges, where there aren't sufficient consequences legally for people who break the law, who are intimidating and harassing public officials. And those two consequences are, one, I think it emboldens people to do more of that. And second, I think it becomes increasingly hard to attract good people and to retain good people in politics. And I think that that is part of the challenge that we face, is having this moment where we need to collectively work together within the political arena, but equally some of the other players, be it in media, social media, and law enforcement. I mean, I will give full credit to law enforcement. I don't think we thank law enforcement enough for the tough job that they do, but we've got to make sure that they've got the resources, we've got to make sure that they've got the authorities, particularly when it comes to this issue. And I think in the unique setting of federal parliamentarians who work on the Hill, but equally back in the constituency offices with different police of jurisdiction, we need better coordination so that we're protected, our families are protected, and our staff are protected.
Well, I wanted to ask you about law enforcement next, because the RCMP Commissioner, Mike Duhem, has said that basically Canada needs new laws to make it easier to charge people who threaten elected officials, because he says too often what happens, it doesn't meet that criminal code threshold to lay a charge of uttering threats, for example. Do you think there needs to be some other legal mechanism there to protect public office holders from the types of things we're seeing more and more?
I don't think we should leave any stone unturned. I don't think we've got the luxury of leaving any stone unturned when it comes to exploring new authorities. I know that it's difficult to get legislation through, but I think that we've shown that on issues related to public safety and national security, that actually there can be cross-party cooperation. I think of Bill C-70, the latest national security legislation, where we got that bill passed, and we got it passed quickly. So I think it behooves us to take a look at the issue very carefully. But I also want to be clear that it's not just about police, that it is about that reflection that I spoke about earlier, that it is about politicians really looking in the mirror, not pointing the finger, that it is about engaging with the media and looking at where the disinformation is, looking at where the conspiracy theories are, and about taking that rhetoric down. And it's only if we do all those things together that I think that we can create an environment that promotes robust debate, but that does not incite violence and hatred.
It's interesting. I remember, and not to go at old wounds, but during the SNC-Lavalin testimony at hearing, Michael Wernick gave a very dire sort of assessment of where he thought politics was going, and said he was terrified that someone was going to get shot in the election. The rise of political violence was something that he was very worried about, and he referred to, I remember the phrase, the vomitorium of social media and the impact that that was having on things. A lot of people kind of scoffed at his warnings back then, sort of post-COVID, post a lot of things. I don't know if they would be scoffing should the current clerks issue a similar warning.
I remember that testimony vividly, and I remember his use of the word vomitorium, which I think is illustrative of just how much volume and how vile the expressions are, and frankly, how much more dangerous it is to be in public life. And just to go back to former President Trump and the tragedy of the last few days, I think as Canadians, we do have this tendency to look at what's happening in the United States and think that that can't happen here. And I think that there is a bit of a stubborn naivete that as Canadians, we won't let that happen in our political arena. But the truth of the matter is that it is. And the statistics which have been trotted out by the Sergeant at Arms are deeply alarming. But I guess what I want to convey to you and to your viewers is that this is real. Like, there are real consequences to the people that work in the arena, to the parliamentarians, to their families, to their constituency staff. I speak with my colleagues and my friends on both sides of the aisle, and they work in a state of fear, and that is wrong. And I think what we have to do is approach this in a very level-headed and thoughtful way, in a clear-eyed way, and recognize that Canada is not immune from political violence, and that we've got to do better, and we've got to take this more seriously. And this should be a call to action to do the things that we need to do with law enforcement, when it comes to better coordination, and certainly with social media and ourselves as politicians.
Okay, so this is one thing that they're dealing with some urgency right now in the United States. Another thing they're dealing with is the party in power is raising a lot of questions about their leader and whether they should stay on. A conversation like that is happening inside your party here in Canada. Where are things in terms of that internal conversation with the Liberal caucus and the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office in terms of what you all do next?
Well, first, my relationship with the Prime Minister is not just professional, it's personal. And so I'm not going to talk about the conversations that we've had or are going to have. But I will say that the Prime Minister has said that he wants to stay on. And at the same time, I think we all recognize that the status quo isn't working. And so I know for a fact that the Prime Minister is reaching out to caucus, is having those conversations, which I think is a healthy thing. And just to tie this issue back to the first thing that we talked about, I think it is important that as we navigate these challenging times, that we have leaders with the right temperament to lead us through these difficult moments, that don't feed into the anger, that don't feed into the raw emotions, but instead are focused on substance, are focused on resolving the big questions, whether it's with regard to the economy, to climate change, or to public safety.
Marco Mendicino, MP for Eglinton Lawrence and former Minister of Public Safety. It's good to have you back on the show.
Yeah,
thanks
again
for
for having me.
I appreciate that.